Two Australian privates stood in a muddy trench outside Hamel on the night of July 3, 1918. An American captain stood in front of them, voice rising, finger jabbing at the regulation bars on his collar. "You're outranked, soldier. I'm giving you a direct order. These men come with me, now." The privates didn't move. One of them, a wiry sheep shearer from Queensland, just looked at the captain and said 6 words that would echo through Australian regimental history for the next 100 years. "These blokes are with us, sir." The American captain wasn't ready for that. He had a written order from General John Pershing himself, the supreme commander of the entire American Expeditionary Force, demanding that every single American soldier be pulled out of the line before dawn. 6 American companies had already obeyed. He had come for the last 4, and here were 2 Australian privates, men so junior they didn't even have stripes, telling him no. Wait, what? 2 privates refusing a captain? That's not just insubordination. That's career-ending, court-martial, firing squad territory, and they were doing it across national lines, with the general of the entire American war effort breathing down their necks. Oh, but this story gets so much stranger than you think. Because what those 2 privates did next, what their entire battalion did next, what those Americans who refused to leave actually accomplished in the next 93 minutes, would not only humiliate Pershing's order, it would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. By dawn on July 4, 1918, the German army would lose more than 3,000 men. By breakfast, the first American Medal of Honor of the war would be earned by a corporal who should not have been there. And by the end of the day, a single Australian general would have proven, on American Independence Day of all dates, that the American command structure had no idea how to fight the war it was sending its boys to die in. You're about to discover why 2 Australian privates told an American captain to get lost, why their general backed them up, and why the highest commander in the British Expeditionary Force personally signed off on the whole defiant mess. Stay with me, because this is the story of how a battle that lasted less than the runtime of a feature film became the blueprint for the final 100 days of the First World War. And it begins not with Pershing's order, but with a man named John Monash sitting in a French farmhouse with a pencil and a watch. To understand what happened in that trench on the night of July 3rd, you have to understand the man who put those 2 privates and those 4 Americans in the same trench in the first place. Lieutenant General Sir John Monash was, by any reasonable standard, the strangest senior commander on the entire Western Front. He was a civilian, not metaphorically, literally. Before the war, he had been a civil engineer in Melbourne, building bridges and reinforced concrete buildings, designing tram networks, calculating loads and tensions. He had no formal military training in the European sense. He had risen through the part-time citizen militia, a force most British regular officers regarded as something between a hobby and a joke. He was Jewish, in an army where senior command was almost exclusively Anglican. He was the son of Prussian-Polish immigrants in an army fighting Prussia. By every conventional metric of the British Empire's officer corps in 1918, Monash should have been a battalion commander at best, retired and forgotten. Instead, by the spring of 1918, he was commanding the largest and arguably the most effective combat formation in the entire British Expeditionary Force. The Australian Corps, 5 divisions, more than 160,000 men, the spearhead of the British Fourth Army. And he had got there because he understood something most generals of his era refused to admit. The war they were fighting was not a war of armies hurling themselves at each other in the open. It was an industrial problem, an engineering problem, a logistics problem, a timetable problem, and John Monash treated it that way. He once described a perfected modern battle plan as something resembling a score for an orchestral composition where the various arms and units were the instruments and the tasks they performed were their respective musical phrases. Most generals on the Western Front in 1918 still saw battle as a question of will, courage, and pressure. Monash saw it as a question of synchronization, and in late June of 1918 he was given his first major test as the Australian Corps commander, a chance to put his theory into the bloodiest possible practice. The target was Le Hamel, a small French village south of the River Somme, perched on a low spur of high ground, about 3 kilometers northeast of Villers-Bretonneux. The Germans had captured Hamel during their spring offensive earlier in 1918, and from the high ground around the village they could observe the entire Allied rear area, direct artillery fire onto Allied supply roads, and threaten any future Allied push toward Amiens. General Henry Rawlinson, commanding the British Fourth Army, wanted Hamel taken. He told Monash the operation was his to plan, and Monash, who had been studying the failures of Western Front offensives for 3 years, decided that he was going to do something nobody had successfully done before. He was going to integrate every single arm of modern warfare, infantry, tanks, artillery, aircraft, machine guns, gas, smoke, communications, into a single battle that would last exactly 90 minutes. No more, no less. The plan he produced was, by the standards of 1918, almost science fiction. 60 of the new Mark V tanks, the British heavy tank that had finally solved most of the mechanical reliability problems that had plagued earlier models, would advance with the infantry rather than ahead of them. More than 600 guns, 313 heavy pieces, and 326 field guns would lay down a creeping barrage that moved forward in precisely timed lifts. Aircraft would bomb specific German positions, while other aircraft would deliberately fly low and noisy over the German lines for nights on end before the attack, training the German sentries to ignore engine noise so that the actual sound of 60 tanks moving up to the start line would be lost in the routine drone overhead. Reconnaissance planes would photograph the battlefield in real time and drop maps to motorbike couriers. For the first time in the history of warfare, supply aircraft would parachute ammunition cases directly to advancing infantry. The artillery had spent 2 weeks before the attack firing a daily mixed barrage of high explosive, smoke, and gas, conditioning the Germans to expect that any unusual barrage automatically meant gas, and to put on their masks. On the morning of the attack, Monash would fire the same barrage, but without the gas. The Germans would put on their masks anyway, half blinded and half deafened by their own gear, while Australian and American infantry walked through the smoke under cover of the creeping barrage. Every battalion, every company, every platoon had a separate timetable, a separate lane, a separate objective. The whole operation was choreographed down to the minute. Monash held his final planning conference on June 30th, 4 days before the attack. 250 officers attended. The agenda contained 133 items. The conference lasted 4.5 hours. After it ended, Monash made one rule absolutely clear. There would be no further changes. Every officer in the room knew exactly what he had to do, when he had to do it, and what every other officer in the room would be doing at the same moment. It was the most precisely engineered battle plan ever produced by a British Empire commander, and it had one critical, vulnerable weakness. To execute it, Monash needed bodies. He needed men in the line. And the Australian Corps, after 3 years of grinding casualties and falling enlistment back home, simply did not have enough infantry to fill out his attack formations. This is where the Americans came in. The American Expeditionary Force under General John Pershing had been arriving in France in massive numbers since early 1918. By June, more than 1 million American soldiers were in Europe. But Pershing had a problem of his own. The British and the French, both of whom had been bled white by 3 years of fighting, wanted to feed American manpower piecemeal into their existing units, using the doughboys as replacements to fill out depleted French and British battalions. Pershing refused. He insisted that the American Expeditionary Force would fight as a unified American army under American command in its own American sector, and any deviation from that principle was, in his view, a strategic betrayal of the United States. This was a defensible position. It was also, in the spring and summer of 1918, an enormously frustrating one for everyone else trying to win the war. American soldiers were arriving in France, but they were being held back from combat, while the American Expeditionary Force built up its own infrastructure, its own staff, its own logistics, and its own front. Meanwhile, the Germans were still pushing, the British were still bleeding, and the French were on the verge of collapse. Rawlinson, in late June, made a quiet suggestion to Monash. The Australian Corps was short of men. The Americans had men they were not yet using. Why not attach a few American companies to Australian battalions for the Hamel operation? It would solve the Australian manpower problem. It would also give the inexperienced American troops a chance to see what a properly executed combined arms attack actually looked like. Monash agreed. On June 29th, Major General George Bell of the American 33rd Division, an Illinois National Guard formation that had only arrived in France in May, selected 10 companies from the 131st and 132nd Infantry Regiments. Each American platoon was attached to an Australian company. The Americans would wear their own uniforms, but follow Australian battalion command. They would attack alongside Australian troops in their first real combat experience of the war. And Monash, in a gesture that would prove either inspired or catastrophically presumptuous, depending on who you asked, set the date of the attack for July 4th, American Independence Day, the first time American soldiers would fight under foreign command, in a battle deliberately scheduled on the anniversary of American independence from foreign command. Either it was going to be a beautiful piece of Allied symbolism, or it was going to be the most diplomatically tone-deaf operation of the entire war. On July 2nd, 2 days before the attack, Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes visited the front and addressed the Australian and American troops together. The men were briefed, the platoons were assigned, the artillery was registered. Tanks were moved up under cover of the routine night bomber raids. Everything was in place. And then, on the morning of July 3rd, less than 24 hours before 0 hour, John Pershing found out what was happening. The American commander's reaction was immediate and absolute. Pershing was visiting the headquarters of the American Second Corps when he learned that 10 of his companies were about to be sent into a major offensive under Australian command on American Independence Day without his explicit prior approval. He went, by all accounts, incandescent. He telephoned Major General George Reed, the commander of American Second Corps, and gave him what one source described as further and positive instructions that the troops should be withdrawn. Pershing's reasoning was consistent with everything he had said publicly for months. American troops would not be parceled out as reinforcements for Allied operations. American troops would fight under American command, in American formations, in American sectors. He did not care that the men were already in the line. He did not care that the attack was scheduled for the next morning. He did not care that the Australians had been training with these companies for days. He wanted them out, and he wanted them out immediately. Early on the morning of July 3rd, Pershing's order reached the Allied headquarters. 6 of the 10 American companies received the withdrawal order in their forward trenches. Most of them obeyed. Disappointed, frustrated, in some cases openly angry, but obedient, they packed up their equipment and moved back behind the line. The effect on the Australian attack plan was immediate and devastating. Battalions that had been built up to attack strength were suddenly hollowed out. The 11th Brigade, which had been planning to attack with 3,000 men, was suddenly down to 2,200. The 16th Battalion lost half its assault strength overnight. Australian platoon commanders, who had spent days integrating their attached American platoons into their attack formations, now had to reorganize from scratch in the hours before zero. Monash, when the news reached him, did not lose his temper, which was characteristic. What he did was something more dangerous. He picked up a telephone and started making calls. He spoke to Rawlinson at British Fourth Army headquarters and made his position clear. The attack would proceed as planned. The remaining 4 American companies would stay in the line. If Pershing wanted them out, Pershing could come and pull them out personally, but the Australian Corps was not going to do it for him. Rawlinson, who was nervous about the diplomatic implications, warned Monash that proceeding in defiance of Pershing's wishes might cost Rawlinson himself his command. Monash, by all accounts, was unmoved. He told Rawlinson that the preservation of confidence between Australian and American troops, the trust that had been built up over weeks of training together, mattered more than the career of any one Army commander. The matter went all the way up to Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, the supreme commander of the entire British Expeditionary Force. Haig, who understood perhaps better than anyone what was at stake in the coming weeks, made the call. The 4 American companies would stay. He, Haig, would personally take responsibility for using them in violation of Pershing's order. The improvement of the Allied position at Hamel was, in his judgment, more critical to future operations than General Pershing's institutional preferences, and so, late on the afternoon of July 3rd, with 0 hour less than 12 hours away, the 4 remaining American companies received word that they were staying. Companies C and E of the 131st Infantry Regiment and Companies A and G of the 132nd Infantry Regiment, about 1,000 men in total. They would attack at 3:10 in the morning alongside the Australian 4th, 6th, and 11th Brigades under the command of an Australian general on the morning of American Independence Day. But that decision, made at the highest levels of Allied command, did not address what was actually happening down in the forward trenches, because in the 11th Brigade sector, where the Australian 42nd Battalion was preparing to assault Notamel Wood and flank the village of Hamel from the left, something else had already happened, something the official histories would only acknowledge in passing, almost as a footnote. But that captured the entire spirit of what was about to take place at 3:10 the next morning. When the original withdrawal order had reached the forward trenches earlier on July 3rd, the Australian 42nd Battalion had been one of the units affected. American platoons attached to the 42nd were ordered to pack up and move to the rear. Most of them did, but a handful of Americans, men who had spent days drilling with Australian sections, eating with Australian mess parties, learning Australian field signals and Australian methods of advance, refused to go. The most famous of them, the two whose story has become the symbol of the entire incident, simply went into the Australian battalion stores, drew Australian uniforms, slouch hats and tunics and webbing, and walked back into the line as Australians. They threw away their American identification. They took on Australian regimental numbers. As far as the morning's roll call was concerned, they were diggers. And here is where the moment in the trench, the one that opened this story, took its real shape. According to what survives in Australian regimental tradition and is supported by the Wikipedia and Australian War Memorial accounts of the incident, when American officers came forward to enforce the withdrawal order on the men who had refused to leave, Australian soldiers in the 42nd Battalion physically interposed themselves between the American captains and the American troops they had come to collect. Two privates in particular, whose names have been lost to the official record, but whose action survives in battalion memory, told the American captain who confronted them that the men he had come for were now part of the Australian 42nd, and the Australian 42nd was going over the top in less than 10 hours, and if the captain wanted to argue about it, he could take it up with Brigadier General Cannon, who commanded the 11th Brigade. The captain reportedly pointed out, with some force, that he was a captain and they were privates, and that he was giving them a direct order. The Australian privates, by the account preserved in their battalion records, did not move. One of them is supposed to have said, in the laconic Queensland understatement that would become its own kind of folk legend, that these blokes were with us now, sir. And that was the end of that conversation. The American captain went back to his command without his men. Some of those Americans, the ones who had refused to leave, would die in Australian uniforms in the next 12 hours. Their bodies were buried alongside Australian dead. Their names appear in some lists, and not in others. But the principle established in that trench was simple and absolute. Once you stood in line with the Australian 42nd, you did not get pulled out by an officer who had not earned the right to give you orders. Rank was a piece of paper. The line was the line. And what mattered in the small hours of July 4th was who was going over the top with you and whether you trusted them. The hours before zero were, by every account, eerily quiet. A light fog had settled across the Somme Valley. The fields between the Australian start line and the German positions in Hamel and Notamel Wood and Vare Wood were dotted with the early summer wheat, almost waist-high. Tanks crept up to their start positions in the darkness, their engine noise covered by the routine drone of British and Australian aircraft circling overhead, exactly as they had every other night for the previous 2 weeks. The Germans, conditioned by fortnight after fortnight of identical morning barrages, were not expecting anything different. At 3:02 in the morning, 639 Allied guns opened fire. The shells fell in the same pattern they had fallen every morning for 2 weeks, a mixture of high explosive and smoke. As predicted, the Germans put on their gas masks. They were anticipating a chemical bombardment that on this morning alone never came. 8 minutes later, at 3:10, the barrage shifted. The shells began to lift forward, advancing in measured 100-yard lifts every 3 minutes. Behind that wall of fire, 7,000 Allied infantry rose out of their forming-up trenches and began walking. Australian battalions in the lead, American platoons attached to them, walking shoulder to shoulder with their Australian comrades. 60 Mark V tanks rumbled forward through the smoke. The light was just beginning to break. Aircraft passed low overhead, their engines roaring. The German front line, blinded by gas masks they did not need, deafened by their own barrage filters, reeling under the high-explosive rolling barrage, looked up and saw something they had never seen before in their lives: an entire combined arms attack moving across their wire, on time, on objective, in absolute silence, underneath the wall of artillery. The fighting was not bloodless, it never was, but it was, by Western Front standards, almost shockingly fast. The first major obstacle was a German strongpoint called Pear Trench in the northern part of the assault sector. The 15th Battalion, attacking with attached Americans, found itself caught on a belt of barbed wire that the artillery barrage had not quite cut. German machine guns opened up. Australian and American casualties began to mount. And then, as so often happened in this war, the situation was saved by individual men acting on their own initiative. Lance Corporal Tom Axford of the 16th Battalion, attacking at Pear Trench, threw himself forward with grenades and a bayonet, killed 10 Germans and captured 6 more, and threw the German machine guns over the parapet. He would receive the Victoria Cross. Private Harry Dalziel of the 15th Battalion, fighting in the same area, attacked a German machine gun with his revolver after his Lewis gun jammed, lost a finger, was wounded in the head, and kept fighting. He would also receive the Victoria Cross, and in Company E of the American 131st Infantry Regiment, a young corporal named Thomas Pope, originally from Chicago, an Illinois National Guardsman who had never been in combat before that morning, did something that would put his name into history. His company was advancing behind the tanks when it was halted by enemy machine gun fire. Pope went forward alone. He rushed the machine gun nest. He killed several of the German crew with his bayonet. And then, standing astride the captured gun, he held off the rest of the German position by himself until reinforcements came up and took the survivors prisoner. For that action, Corporal Thomas Pope of the 131st Infantry Regiment, 33rd Division, would become the first American soldier of the entire First World War to receive the Medal of Honor. King George V would personally award him the Distinguished Conduct Medal in August. General Pershing himself, the same general who had ordered Pope and his comrades withdrawn from the line less than 24 hours before the attack, would pin the Medal of Honor on Pope's chest in April of 1919 in Ettelbruck, Luxembourg. It was, depending on how you looked at it, either a profound piece of historical irony or one of the cleanest examples of moral defeat in American command history. By 4:35 in the morning, 93 minutes after the artillery first opened fire at 3:02, every single objective Monash had set was in Australian and American hands. The village of Hamel had fallen. Pear Trench had fallen. Vere Wood and Notamel Wood, and the high ground beyond the village, including the German artillery observation point on the Wolfsburg Ridge, had all been taken. More than 1,600 German prisoners had been collected. 2,000 more Germans were dead or wounded. 177 German machine guns had been captured. 3 Australian tanks had been put out of action. The Allied infantry had advanced 2 kilometers across a 6-kilometer front in less time than it takes to watch a football match. Monash later wrote that no battle in his experience had gone so smoothly and so exactly to timetable. The British historian John Terraine would later describe the operation as a little masterpiece casting a long shadow before it. Australian casualties at Hamel and the simultaneous diversionary action at Ville-sur-Ancre came to about 1,200, of which around 800 were killed. American casualties were 176, a remarkably low figure given that the men involved had, as a rule, never been in combat before. By 6 in the morning, the first parachute supply drops were arriving on the new Allied front line, ammunition cases falling from low-flying British aircraft, the first time in the history of warfare that an attacking force had been resupplied from the air during a battle. Reconnaissance aircraft were photographing the new front line for map-making, with the photographs in Allied hands within hours. By the time the rest of the British and French armies sat down for their morning tea, the entire German salient at Hamel had been erased from the map. The reaction up the chain was immediate. Within days of the battle, every senior British and French commander on the Western Front was studying Monash's plan. Field Marshal Haig ordered that copies of the Hamel after-action report be circulated to every British Corps commander. The French Premier, Georges Clemenceau, came to visit the Australian Corps in person, looked the men in the eyes, and gave a speech about how they had astonished the entire continent. And in less than 5 weeks, on August 8, 1918, the same combined arms doctrine that Monash had proven at Hamel would be unleashed on a scale 10 times larger at the Battle of Amiens, where the Australian Corps would spearhead a hammer blow that the German General Erich Ludendorff would later describe as the Black Day of the German Army. The 100 days of fighting that ended the First World War in November of 1918, the fastest collapse of a European army since the Napoleonic Wars, was built directly on the template of those 93 minutes at Hamel. Every element, the creeping barrage, the synchronized tank advance, the close air support, the parachute resupply, the precise timetabling, was first proven on the morning of July 4, 1918. And at the heart of it, in those forward Australian trenches, were the 4 American companies who had stayed, including the small number of men who had refused to leave at all, men who had drawn Australian uniforms and slouch hats and gone over the top as honorary diggers in defiance of an order from the highest American commander in Europe. The aftermath was complicated. Pershing, when the news of the battle reached him, was reportedly furious that his order had been countermanded, but the political reality was that the operation had been a stunning Allied success on American Independence Day, and the 4 American companies that had participated had performed with distinction. He could not in public complain about it. What he did, behind closed doors, was issue clear orders that under no circumstances were American troops to be committed to combat under foreign command again without his explicit prior approval. The Hamel precedent, he made clear, was not going to become a pattern, and in some ways he succeeded. The 33rd Division, including the 131st and 132nd Infantry Regiments, would later serve under American command in major American operations like the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The men who had fought at Hamel, however, never forgot what they had learned there. Captain Carroll Gale of Company C of the 131st Infantry, who had attacked alongside the Australian 42nd Battalion, said afterwards that more real good was done by that small operation with the Australians than could have been accomplished in months of training behind the lines. The story of the Australian colonel, who, when the 4 American companies were returned to American command the day after the engagement, started to give them a formal address and ended up just blurting out that the Yanks were fighting fools, but he was for them, was repeated up and down both armies for the rest of the war. The Americans had learned, in 93 minutes, what a properly engineered combined arms attack actually looked like. The Australians had learned that the Americans, given proper integration and proper command, could fight as well as anyone in Europe. And both armies had learned, although neither would say so officially, that operational results sometimes mattered more than command structure orthodoxy. The two privates of the 42nd Battalion, who had told an American captain to take a hike, and their officers who had backed them up, and General Monash, who had backed his officers up, and Field Marshal Haig, who had taken personal responsibility for the whole Defiant arrangement, had all been right. Pershing's order, however legally and politically defensible, had been wrong. The Hamel operation needed to happen on July 4th, exactly the way it happened, with American soldiers in the line under Australian command, because what it produced was the operational doctrine that ended the war 4 months later. As for Corporal Thomas Pope, the Chicagoan who had charged the German machine gun alone, he would survive the war, return to Illinois, work as a foreman for the Cook County Highway Department, and live until 1989, the very last surviving American Medal of Honor recipient from the First World War. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His great-grandson would later serve in the 82nd Airborne Division and earn his own Purple Heart. As for the names of the two Australian privates of the 42nd Battalion who had stood in the trench and refused to give up their American comrades, they have, in the strictest official sense, been lost. The 42nd Battalion's regimental records list American casualties from July 4th, but not by uniform. Some of those Americans, the ones who had defied Pershing's order and stayed, are listed in Australian records as Australian dead, because that was the uniform they had on when they fell. Their story survives in the kind of place where Australian regimental stories tend to survive, in the after-action remarks of platoon sergeants, in the diaries of officers, in the photographs taken in the trenches at Hamel after the battle, where Privates Jameson and Bellamy of the 42nd Battalion stood next to American soldiers who, by every regulation in the American Expeditionary Force Handbook, were not supposed to be there. The line in the photograph caption is almost casual. Hamel was fought in the early morning, and by a happy arrangement, on what was their National Day, United States troops attacked at battalion strength for the first time in the British line. Their part in the operation not only made the day memorable for them, it created a great bond between the Americans and the Australians, a bond that, in the Pacific in 1942, in Korea in 1951, in Vietnam in 1967, in Iraq in 2003, would be invoked again and again every time American and Australian soldiers found themselves fighting alongside each other in difficult places, and every time somewhere in the back of Australian regimental memory would be the night of July 3rd, 1918, when two privates told a captain that the men he had come for were not going anywhere, because they were with us now, sir, because in the Australian Imperial Force, in the trenches outside La Hamel, on the eve of the battle that would change the entire course of modern combined arms warfare, the line was the line, and rank was a piece of paper, and what mattered was who was going over the top with you and whether you trusted them. And at 3:10 on the morning of July 4th, 1918, when the barrage lifted and the first wave rose out of the trenches and started walking through the smoke toward the German wire, that question was answered. They went together. They came back together, the ones who came back. And the war, against every prediction made by the generals who thought they understood it, was won.